There are plenty of concerns around the outlook for the global economy, geopolitical tensions not least. According to Nobel Prize-winning economist Robert Shiller, the risk of a recession may be more likely from fear than an absolute financial meltdown. His most recent book is Narrative Economics: How Stories Go Viral and Drive Major Economic Events. Robert Shiller, of course, an economics prof at Yale University, is with us now. Thank you for being with us, sir.
My pleasure.
So I actually want to start with, you really helped pioneer but also solidify the value of anecdotal data in predictive economics. When you talk about narrative, do you mean next level because of the sheer volume and our ability to manipulate the data we have?
Well, I'm talking about popular narratives among the general public that sway public opinion, stories that spread from person to person. Economists have not paid much attention overall to such narratives, even though we now have much better data that allows us to count what's going on in newspapers, magazines, etc.
So in terms of how we should be using that, obviously we are aware that, for instance, recessions, like a run on the bank, can be self-fulfilling prophecies. How do you think economists will use some of these narrative data points to help us understand where things are going?
Well, I'll give you an example. If you go to Google Trends, it's a free service you can get on trends.google.com. You can search for what other people are searching, what they've been searching for recently on the web. And so if you search for recession, you see a big spike in 2007, right before the financial crisis. And you see a spike in 2019, just now, almost as big. So that makes you wonder if people are worried about recession so much, and we can see it in the data, maybe they'll pull back on their spending. They haven't yet, but maybe they will pull back on their spending and create another recession.
What's the role of the media in all of this?
The news media, well, before there were news media, there were no important speculative bubbles. The first newspapers appeared in the early 1600s in the Netherlands, and what did we get? We got tulip mania. That was the first example of a bubble. You have to have some boost to broad communications to make a concerted action among millions of people. So the news media are part of it. They're also do wonderful things for us too, so I'm not criticizing them.
So if we follow this, the kind of the wisdom of the crowds theory, and you take that kind of narrow casting of traditional media, but you now broaden it out to the Twitter, to the Google, to everybody in the world is now a representative of the media in some fashion, should that not actually reduce the prevalence of bubbles? In other words, all of the information will now be available and it won't be as skewed?
I think it's hard to predict what will be the effect on bubbles and on recessions because we could actually communicate pretty fast long ago, hundreds of years ago, just by word of mouth. When you say going viral, that conveys the idea that a story can go viral like a disease. But diseases, they don't go through the internet. They don't go through modern communication. And they've been with us for thousands of years by contagion from person to person. That is still the main force, I think, in conveying narratives.
So when you, therefore, and maybe this is a bit of a setup question, but when you look around the world and all of the things that could cause a dislocation for markets, you so accurately predicted the last few. I'm curious to know what you're looking at as the possible source of the next one.
Well, I'm thinking that we have narratives that are, at the moment, encouraging strong consumer spending. So in the United States, we have an atmosphere of success. It's maybe helped along by our billionaire president, who is a motivational speaker and who writes books about how you can make yourself new and important by living a story. So people are doing that. But that kind of thing can falter with the changed narrative. And we have scares recently, notably the attack on the oil, Arab oil, Arabian oil, that sounds familiar. It sounds like bad news that could lead to a recession.
So, I mean, obviously, the consumer is definitely driving, and without the consumer, I think we may well see dire economic conditions at the moment because business sentiment has been lacking. Where does that end up? Are you watching debt levels? Is that the place where we might see sort of the crisis enter the economy?
I think our narratives about debt levels may change. I don't actually need to follow closely the exact month-to-month change in debt levels, but I think that the housing market has recovered relatively slowly in the United States. I know it's been doing great in Canada, but in the United States after the crisis, it has been slow to recover, and that was in partly because of fear of indebtedness. It was a narrative about let's not repeat that last crisis.
Is it possible to control the narrative better?
That's something that public figures have to instinctively do. Right now, I don't think there's much of a science to it. But you know, people who are on top of good politicians understand at some intuitive level narratives, and they're careful what they say. They have to be careful because people may overinterpret. And they may remember what someone said, some politician said. They may remember it for years. It can have a long-term effect. They have to be careful.
There are some narratives that seem, they sell politically, but they're a little more complicated. One I would point to in the U.S. is the kind of blame the Fed narrative that we've seen emerge, even though, of course, money remains easy by historical standards. Where does that narrative take the U.S. In terms of the president pitting kind of success and winning against his own central bank?
I think of this as kind of a troublesome narrative, one that relates to our polarization in the United States. To me, it has a danger of destroying confidence. It hasn't done that. But one thing I talk about in my book is that narratives can change their impact through time, through subtle, just as an epidemic disease can change its impact. With a seemingly minor mutation. So I'm troubled by this. There's another narrative about machines replacing jobs. That's very strong. Well, we call it artificial intelligence. But it doesn't seem to be curtailing expenditure yet. But that could also change. If we start to see a recession, people could start worrying about their jobs and cut back their spending.
So economists, of course, like data, as the old saw goes. You only trust the data. So how does narrative kind of view fit into needing to gather data, which sometimes these days does feel disconnected from the narratives that are out there?
Well, there's two kinds of data. There's government-collected data that have been around ever since the 1930s. Like gross domestic product and unemployment rates. But now economists are getting much more versatile in their access to data. And now you can search so many digitized sources. You can invent your own data series. And I think this will bring us around to a more narrative-based. People will see more richness in the thinking of people. It's not just the simple models that we had before. But I think it'll take economists decades to really learn how to use the new data more effectively.